the bar was humming with life, a place where the night never seemed to end. Glasses clinked, bursts of laughter bounced off the walls, and the jukebox belted out an old rock anthem that stirred memories of decades past. It was a typical Friday evening at Max's Roadhouse, nestled just outside Nashville. The regulars, familiar faces all, clustered at the counter, bantering about everything from the latest game to the mundane details of their day. The air buzzed with the rhythm of their chatter. In the far corner, nearly swallowed by shadows, sat a man, an old figure, his presence somehow still commanding despite his age. He cradled a glass of whiskey with a steady hand, his fingers unmoving, like he was locked in quiet conversation with the amber liquid. His back was straight, posture unyielding, and his eyes never wavered from the glass, as though it held some secret, some unsaid truth. On his head, a weathered olive-green cap rested, the military insignia faded but proud. It had seen years, perhaps decades, of life, much like the man himself, frayed at the edges but brimming with an unspoken dignity. The door slammed open, and the bikers entered, a whirlwind of black leather and bravado. 6 of them, each one a towering figure cloaked in patches, their presence loud and commanding. The room felt their arrival as if it had been momentarily shaken from its routine. The leader, a hulking man with a thick beard, slapped the bar with a force that rattled the glasses. His booming laugh seemed to reverberate through the very walls as he barked out orders for a round of beers. The regulars cast a quick, sidelong glance in their direction but quickly returned to their drinks, the unspoken rule being to avoid the biker's gaze if you wanted a peaceful night. But then, one of them, a younger biker, noticed the old man in the corner. His voice cut through the noise like a sudden snap. "Hey, check it out," he said, nudging his friend. "Grandpa's out past his bedtime." The others chuckled, their eyes shifting to the figure in the corner, but the old man didn't flinch. He remained silent, unmoving, the slight stir of his drink the only indication that he was even aware of their presence. His calmness only seemed to provoke them further. "Bet he doesn't even remember what year it is," another voice called out, louder now, more brazen. Still, the old man didn't react. His glass met his lips again, and he took a slow, deliberate sip, as if savoring the moment in defiance of their mockery. The leader of the group, the one they called Tank, flashed a smirk and turned to his crew. "Maybe he's one of those war vets," he said, mocking, his voice dripping with condescension. "What do you think, boys? Want to go pay our respects?" The bartender, Charlie, who had seen enough barroom brawls in his life to know how these things went, shot them a sharp warning. "Leave him alone," he grunted, his voice low but firm. "He's not bothering anybody." But the bikers were far from in the mood for caution. The night had taken a new turn, and they were just getting started. They moved toward the corner, their footsteps deliberate, each step echoing in the heavy silence that followed. The room shifted, the noise fading as all eyes turned toward the unfolding scene. Conversations died, the clinking of glasses stilled, and the air grew thicker, heavier. It felt as though the very walls were holding their breath. Most of the regulars knew better than to interfere when the bikers set their sights on something, but a few exchanged uneasy glances, silently hoping Charlie would step in. Charlie, however, stayed put, wiping down the counter with an air of quiet expectation. The leader, Tank, finally reached the old man's table. He stood towering over the seated figure, his grin spreading wide. "Hey there, Pop," he said, leaning in just enough to invade the man's space. "That's a nice hat you've got. Military, huh? You see some action back in the day?" The old man didn't respond. Instead, he adjusted the brim of his cap, slowly, deliberately, before taking another sip of his whiskey. His silence only made Tank push harder. "What's the matter?" Tank pressed, his voice rising. "Cat got your tongue, or are you just too old to hear me?" A younger biker snickered. "Maybe he's gone deaf. Or maybe he's just scared." The old man finally set his glass down, his movements smooth and controlled. He looked up, meeting Tank's gaze with a calmness that seemed to catch the biker off guard. "Do you boys need something?" he asked, his voice low and steady, his eyes piercing through the tension that crackled in the air. Tank's confidence faltered for a fraction of a second, but it quickly returned with a smirk. "Yeah," he said, his voice tinged with mocking frustration. "We need you to lighten up. You're killing the vibe in here. Sitting all quiet like that." The old man leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I'm just enjoying my drink," he said quietly. "You should try doing the same." For a heartbeat, it seemed like Tank might back off, but pride swelled within him. His grin faded, replaced by a hard edge. "You think you're funny, old man?" he sneered, and before anyone could react, he snatched the cap from the old man's head and held it high, like a trophy. "Why don't you tell us what makes you so special? What's this supposed to mean, huh?" A murmur rippled through the bar. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as the tension mounted. Everyone watched, rooted to their seats, as the old man stood, slow and measured. His face was etched with the lines of time, each one a testament to a life lived, to battles fought and endured. His voice was steady, but sharp as he spoke. "That's not yours," he said, his tone cool and unwavering. "Now hand it back." The younger bikers laughed nervously, unsure of how far this would go. Tank, bolstered by their support, waved the cap like a toy, mocking the old man. "What's the matter, old-timer? You gonna call your bingo buddies to come back?" But the old man didn't blink. He simply stared at Tank, his silence louder than any words could have been. The bartender, Charlie, finally spoke again, his voice cutting through the growing tension like a knife. "Tank," he warned, his voice firm. "Don't push it. You don't know who you're messing with." But it was too late. Tank's ego had already taken over, and the challenge had been laid. The old man took a step forward, his presence suddenly seeming much larger than his frame. The room held its breath, the weight of the moment settling on everyone like a heavy cloak. The bikers weren't laughing anymore. Tank rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed, but before he could protest, Charlie's voice cut through the air, sharp and unwavering. "You have no idea who this man is, do you?" The room fell into a heavy silence, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Even Tank, usually so full of bravado, froze. For the first time, his cocky demeanor faltered, and his eyes flickered with uncertainty. Charlie's words sliced through the tension, leaving an electric charge in the air, all eyes now locked on the bartender as he stepped forward. The old man, General Harris, was about to reveal something that would shake this moment to its core. Charlie, standing firm between the bikers and the old man, locked his gaze with Tank. "You idiots really don't know who you're messing with," he growled. His voice was low, but each word carried the weight of a threat that no one could ignore. He pointed to the cap Tank still held, now hanging limply in his hand. "That's not just any military hat," Charlie continued, his voice growing colder, sharper. "That belongs to Lieutenant General Raymond Ray Harris, Vietnam, Gulf War, Black Ops. You're standing in front of one of the most decorated war heroes this country has ever known." The words hung in the air, their impact like a sudden storm crashing over the room. The bikers, who had been laughing just moments ago, now stared in stunned silence. The room itself seemed to shrink under the weight of Charlie's revelation. Tank's grin slipped away, replaced by a confused, disbelieving scowl. "You're joking," he muttered, but the challenge in his voice lacked its usual confidence. Charlie didn't back down. He crossed his arms, his gaze never wavering. "I've seen him on TV. I've read about him in history books. Hell, he's got a plaque at the VFW down the road." Charlie's voice dropped lower, the truth hitting harder. "And let me tell you something, you don't want to piss off a man like this." The old man, General Harris, hadn't moved a muscle. He stood silently, his gaze unwavering, his hands steady at his sides. Then, his voice, calm yet firm, cut through the tension. "Charlie, you don't need to do this," he said, his tone almost a warning. But Charlie ignored him, his presence unwavering. He took a step closer to Tank, his voice now colder than before. This man has seen things you can't even begin to imagine. While you're here trying to play tough guy, he's fought wars, led men, and done things that most of us wouldn't survive. If he wanted to, he could take you apart without even breaking a sweat. The room was still, the air thick with anticipation. The bikers exchanged nervous glances, their earlier swagger evaporating. Even the youngest among them, who had been laughing moments ago, now looked visibly uneasy. Tank swallowed hard, his tough demeanor faltering. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. How do you know he's not just some old guy spinning war stories? Tank muttered, though the challenge now seemed empty, hollow. Charlie's gaze was unwavering, his voice like steel as he replied, "Because I served under him." His words sliced through the room, each one carrying the weight of experience. 20 years ago, in the Gulf, he saved my life and a dozen others in a firefight we weren't supposed to make it out of. And trust me, you don't forget a man like that. The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes were on the old man, who now stepped forward with measured calm. He reached out, taking back his hat from Tank's trembling hand. He adjusted it carefully, smoothing the worn brim before looking Tank in the eye. "You've had your fun," General Harris said, his voice steady but firm. "Now sit down, finish your drinks, and let this be the end of it." For a moment, it seemed like Tank might protest. His jaw worked, his fists clenched at his sides, but the weight of the room, the gaze of the crowd, the bartender's unwavering stance, and the quiet authority radiating from the old man were too much. Finally, Tank stepped back, his hands raised in surrender. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "No harm done, right?" Harris didn't respond. He simply turned, sitting back down and reaching for his glass of whiskey, as though nothing had happened. But the tension in the room hadn't fully eased. As the bikers shuffled back to their table, General Harris did something unexpected. He spoke again, his voice breaking the silence like a sharp knife cutting through thick air. The room held its breath. "You boys think the world owes you something," Harris began, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it now, a warning. He didn't look directly at the bikers, but it was clear who his words were meant for. Tank and his crew froze, their beers untouched. The other patrons leaned in, curiosity now outweighing their discomfort. Even Charlie, who had been retreating behind the bar, paused mid-motion, his eyes now locked on Harris. "I've seen men like you before," Harris continued, tilting his glass thoughtfully. "Men who think strength comes from the size of their muscles or how loud they can shout. But real strength," he set the glass down with a soft clink that seemed louder than it should have been. "Real strength is something else entirely." The room was silent, hanging on every word. Harris leaned forward, his hands clasped together, his gaze distant. "I was 19 when I learned what real strength looks like," he said, his voice softening, yet each word still carrying the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. "Fresh out of basic, thrown into the jungles of Vietnam. No amount of training prepares you for that. The heat. The fear. The noise. Or the silence, the kind of silence that makes you wonder if the next step you take will be your last." The room was entirely still now, everyone's attention fixed on the old man's words. Harris continued, his voice gaining strength as he went on. "There was this mission, a rescue op. 2 of our guys were pinned down, surrounded by enemy fire. Command told us it was a suicide run, but we went anyway. Not because we wanted to be heroes. No one thinks about medals in moments like that. But because leaving them behind wasn't an option." His eyes seemed to lose focus, as if he could still see the jungle in his mind, still haunted by the faces of the men he had lost. "We lost 2 men that day," he said softly. "Good men. But we brought those boys home. I still see their faces sometimes, those we lost and those we saved. And every time I do, I remind myself, real strength isn't about what you take. It's about what you're willing to give." The bikers sat frozen, their earlier swagger gone completely. Even Tank, who had been so sure of himself just moments ago, was now staring at the table, his jaw tight, his hands trembling slightly. Harris's voice softened but remained no less powerful. I've carried men out of burning vehicles, patched up wounds with my bare hands, and held brothers while they took their last breaths, he continued, the gravity of his words hanging heavily in the air. I fought for this country, for the freedoms you enjoy, without a second thought. And what do you do with that freedom? You come into a bar and harass an old man who's just trying to enjoy a drink. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over the bikers. You think that makes you tough? He asked, his voice heavy with disdain. Son, you don't know the first thing about tough. The room was utterly still, the silence suffocating. Even the jukebox, usually playing softly in the corner, seemed to have gone silent, its hum replaced by the heavy weight of Harris's words. Harris took a deep breath, the weight of his memories pressing down on him, but his face remained calm, resolute. You don't have to prove you're strong by tearing someone else down, he said, his voice quiet but firm. The weight of Harris's words lingered in the air, heavy and unyielding. For the first time that night, the bikers, those who had swaggered in like kings of the world, now looked like boys caught in the act of something shameful. The silence in the room was palpable, thick with anticipation. All eyes were on the bikers, waiting. The crowd seemed to hold its breath. Tank, once the loudest voice, the source of the chaos, sat motionless. His eyes dropped to the table in front of him, unable to meet Harris's piercing gaze. The others fidgeted, squirming in their seats, the old man's words sinking into them like a stone. The tension that had once crackled in the room now hung like a thick fog. The air had changed. Charlie, ever the observer, leaned against the bar with his arms crossed, waiting to see how the bikers would respond. It was Tank who broke the silence, though his voice was no longer strong and certain. His words stumbled out, clumsy, unsure. I didn't know. All right? I didn't know who you were. Harris stared at him, unwavering, his calm gaze demanding the truth from Tank, forcing him to confront the shame he tried to bury under layers of bravado. Tank swallowed hard, his voice now quieter, almost pleading. We were just messing around. I didn't mean any disrespect. The youngest biker, who had laughed the loudest earlier, spoke up. His voice cracked, trembling with the weight of his embarrassment. We're sorry, sir. We didn't know. Harris's hands rested on the table as he leaned forward, his voice firm but not unkind. You shouldn't need to know someone's story to treat them with respect, he said. Every person you meet has fought battles you can't see. Some of those battles leave scars on the outside. Others? They're carried inside. And it costs you nothing to show decency. The younger biker nodded quickly, his face burning with shame. Yes, sir. You're right. I'm sorry. Tank, who had once towered over the room, now met Harris's eyes. His apology felt strange, unfamiliar, but it was sincere. I'm sorry too, he muttered, voice softer now, as if admitting something he'd never wanted to face. Then, after a long pause, he stood and extended his hand to Harris. Thank you for your service, and for reminding us what really matters. Harris studied him for a moment before shaking his hand, his grip firm but not overpowering. Apology accepted, he said, his voice carrying weight. But remember this moment. Don't let it fade when you leave this place. Tank nodded solemnly, his words quiet but resolute. We won't forget. And for the first time, there was a true sincerity in his voice, a softness the bikers had never shown before. The other men mumbled their apologies, their voices subdued, genuine. The tension began to ease, replaced by a quiet, reluctant relief. The atmosphere, once thick with hostility, was now lighter, though the weight of the moment still lingered. The patrons of the bar slowly returned to their conversations, their voices lowered, as if trying to hold on to the lesson that had just been shared. Charlie clapped Tank on the shoulder, a rare compliment slipping from his gruff mouth. Smart move, son, he said. Now why don't you boys finish your beers and call it a night? The bikers nodded in silent agreement, retreating to their table. They sat in unexpected quiet, their earlier rowdiness gone, replaced with something more introspective. Harris, meanwhile, took a slow sip from his whiskey, gazing out the window. His calm presence spoke volumes. He didn't need to say another word. The lesson had been delivered. The night at Max's Roadhouse, once filled with tension and loud voices, now had a different rhythm. The conversations were quieter, thoughtful. The patrons glanced over at the corner, where Harris sat, their eyes filled with a mix of awe and gratitude. The bikers, still in their seats, exchanged quiet words. Tank, who had been the center of attention just moments ago, now seemed lost in thought. His expression was unreadable, but it was clear that the encounter had affected him more than he was willing to admit. General Harris finished his whiskey. The amber liquid gleamed in the low light as he set the empty glass down. He stood, his movements slow, deliberate, and adjusted his cap with a quiet grace. The room watched him, a silent recognition of the power he carried in just his presence. He didn't acknowledge the stares. He simply turned to Charlie, giving him a small, respectful nod. Charlie, his usual rough exterior softened for just a moment, nodded back. "Take care of yourself, General," he said quietly. Harris moved toward the door, his steps measured, each one deliberate. Just before he left, he paused, looked over his shoulder, and his voice cut through the room one last time. "Remember," he said, his words as steady and calm as before, "respect doesn't cost you anything, but the lack of it might." With that, he stepped into the cool night, the door swinging closed behind him, leaving the bar in a thoughtful, reflective silence. Tank watched him go, his jaw clenched, as if he wanted to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, he turned to his crew, his voice low but resolute. "We've got some work to do," he said, his tone firmer now, the weight of the encounter settling in. "Can't be the men we were tonight." The youngest biker nodded solemnly, his voice quiet. "Yeah. We can do better." The rest of the crew murmured their agreement. There was a quiet, meaningful shift in their demeanor. They weren't the same men who had walked in just hours ago. The change in them was undeniable. And it was clear that this night, this lesson, would stay with them long after they left. Inside the bar, Charlie gently placed Harris's empty glass in the sink. He stared at it for a moment, lost in thought, before speaking softly to himself. "That's the kind of man who reminds you what honor looks like." The patrons, too, returned to their conversations, but the energy in the room had shifted. It was less rowdy now, more reflective. The weight of Harris's words and presence remained, though it was no longer as oppressive. It was a reminder, quiet and powerful, of the strength in humility. Outside, Harris walked toward his cart under the bright stars. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. His life had been spent teaching lessons through his actions, and tonight had been no different. He hoped the bikers would carry his lesson with them, the kind of lesson that couldn't be taught, only earned. Respect and humility, not through words, but through what you give, even when it costs you something. As the night carried on, the patrons of the bar were left with more than just the memory of an old man's words. They had been reminded of something timeless, the quiet strength that comes with respect for others. And for the bikers, this story would stick with them far longer than they could have anticipated.